So $1 billion sounds like a lot of money, but not nearly enough to cover this budget hole, right?
Well, all depends on how you look at the budget hole. They've already acknowledged they're going to borrow $3-point-some billion to get through this.
I think it's 3.4, Jim.
$3.4 billion of more borrowing. I think what this shows is that the tough decisions still are out ahead of us. I think what's interesting about this budget is it's roughly $26 billion. That's the same amount the government spent in 2006. We have roughly the same population today, a couple 100,000 more people today than we did then. Why is there such a crisis in spending? And the truth of the matter is that the core problem is that spending is up 39% after inflation over the last 10 years. So we've ramped up our spending excessively.
But there is also a much greater need for social services given the economic climate, correct?
Well, there's some truth to that. You know, the unemployment is up over 600,000 now. Of course, all those people are getting unemployment benefits. What we wanted to find out is the exact question you just asked. Are there more demands for services? So when this whole budget crisis started, we began a Freedom of Information program to find out how many people are getting services by department. And we've not had a real good response to all those Freedom of Information requests, but we have had some. For example, the number of kids in foster care today are fewer than there were in 2006, yet spending is supposedly at a crisis. The number of prisoners are roughly 45,000 today. It was roughly 45,000 in 2006. So what I think really should be done is let's look at each department line by line, the number of people receiving services, the amount of money spent in 2006, which is sort of the baseline number, versus the amount of money being spent now. And I think we could actually find out why we have a crisis and then fix it better than we are right now.
John, isn't it true that the lawmakers just sort of dumped this on the governor's lap in an election year and made him make these tough choices as to where to look in the state budget?
I think that's exactly right, Jack. Whenever there's tough choices, everybody wants to run for the door and avoid responsibility, and that's exactly what they did. And as a result of that, the governor does have to make tough choices. What I think is interesting is that the tough choices are falling on the backs of the people who provide contract services for the government, for people getting social services, and on those people who've come to depend on the government. The tough choices are not being made by the public employee unions. Their spokesman recently said that they're going to go back and ask for more revenue because they don't want to sacrifice it all. Everybody in the state needs to sacrifice, so should the public employee unions.
Well, what the governor's office would argue is that those are negotiated contracts and you have to sit down with the unions again and go back into negotiations to see if you can get furloughs, for instance. He is allowed to make layoffs, but the furloughs are not in the contracts.
I think that's exactly right. I think that's an interesting point, but I think the key question here for your viewers is why is it the governor is willing to bring people to Springfield, thousands of people who count on public services, to try to rally for a tax hike, but he's not willing to bring those same people back to rally for the unions making some sacrifices themselves by perhaps taking a temporary pay cut? Why is all the political pressure to gin up interest in a tax hike and not to apply pressure to the public employee unions?
In fairness, John, is it really just unions that are driving this increase in state spending? I mean, you know, we have to be even-handed about this, and it's growth across the board, isn't it?
No question. That's my point earlier when I was saying that the problem is 39% total growth over 10 years after inflation. It's not just the unions, but the unions are a place where you can actually see some inequity. The unions, a union employee in the state, public employee union employee, makes on average 12% more than a private sector counterpart. That's a place where I would think there's time for shared sacrifice, and that's why I bring that up.
Apples and apples, though?
Yes, those are apples and apples, and we have a study on our website that demonstrates that.
1,073 cuts in the Department of Corrections, 866 in the Department of Human Services, 303 in the state police. I mean, that does sound like a lot of personnel cuts.
Those are personnel cuts that I think are interesting to dig into a little bit more. Let's take the Department of Corrections as an example. I mentioned earlier roughly 45,000 prisoners in 2006, same amount today. But what's interesting to me is that from 2008 to 2009, when we already knew we had a budget crisis, spending in the Department of Corrections, despite that flat head count and a declining employee count, actually went up 15%. So one should be digging deeper to find out why we have this unstructured spending increase.
But we know the governor is on record as wanting an income tax increase. All of this is a scene setter for what may occur in November or more probably next January.
I think that's exactly right, which is why they keep focusing on the core government services and putting the people most vulnerable at risk as political pawns, to be very frank about it, because they want to try to create the impetus for a tax hike rather than looking for how to sacrifice and reform spending to be more efficient and respond to the fact that they've overspent in the previous years.
John, thank you for coming in this morning.
Thanks so much for having me.